Okay, Whirlo celebration, that's why we're here, and we've cherry-picked a few of the events and activities that we had, which you've seen on the video, to raise some of the issues. So, the project and its achievements, in some ways it feels like it's only yesterday when we started. In some ways it feels like it's a long, long time that we've been going on. So the project and its achievements, surveys and findings. One of the things we set out to do was try and get baseline information. We want to know what we've got, what we're dealing with. And some of that's good, some of that's bad. Some raises challenges. But we looked at woods and trees. And we've got the extensive area which is down as Bowl Hill Plantation outside the park, but very close to it. And that has to be in part ancient woodland. And it's got lots of archaeology in it. It is a problem for the Lynn Brook, it's a problem for the mill pond, which I sometimes call the lake, the big water body, because under that plantation there's very little vegetation. It was planted up by the Victorians with beech trees, and it is eroding soil very, very fast, which destroys the archaeology but also washes away the ecology, and it ends up as silt and hence pollution in the stream and silt in the big lake. So quite serious issues. And we do have one of the workshops that Christine will mention that's coming up, sponsored separately from the Heritage Lottery project, but associated to it, is going to be on soil erosion and soil problems in local woodlands. So we're trying to get other groups to come and join you in that discussion. And it will ultimately require some fairly major management of the wood to resolve that, and that's outside the scope of what the Friends group can do, but you can act as advocates, if you like, raising it as an issue. But we also looked at the remnant woodlands within the park, and this is something which is often overlooked, but we can look at indicator species and some fantastic veteran trees, and you're quite clearly on the western side of the main lake, there's remnants of an ancient woodland. Really, really quite exciting. And some trees. And again, the group have then been doing an audit of the trees in the park, including the ornamentals. And one of the issues, obviously, is that this is a park and it is a garden, and it has what we would describe as a shadow of the semi-natural landscape from times past, but you're not dealing with a pristine natural site. So as we mentioned in the video, it's inappropriate to think, we should eradicate everything that's non-native. A, it's not possible, and B, it's not sensible or desirable. And I was in the park a few weeks back and was photographing mandarin ducks on the lake, which people are getting very excited about now. Most people like them, but they are a non-native, like the parakeets, they're a non-native. But you have to ask, A, do we want to do anything about them? A, and B, is it possible? And I suspect not. So we're dealing with a gardened landscape. We're dealing with a created planted landscape. We've got some fantastic trees. We've got this link back to ancient woodland. Climate change is going to alter the balance, and climate change may start to mean that some trees don't thrive or don't survive, and we need to think about planting for future generations in a changed environment. The other thing that climate change is doing, and I have a personal view on some of the actions to this, which I will not get sidetracked into, but it's bringing all sorts of diseases and pests. And that will get worse, not better. And one of the issues that rises from that is a fundamental question of why. Because it's environmental stress is the answer, it's climate change, it's nutrient fallout from power stations and petrol and other disruptions. So we're living in a landscape that the trees find difficult and challenging, and that makes them vulnerable. We're also dealing with a Disney-fied, globalized world where diseases are moving around the planet. So new ones arrive. So that is something that we need to be aware of, we need to think about. We have the grasslands. Now, most of the grasslands in the park are not semi-natural grasslands. They are mainly manicured, short-mown turf. And we can see that from some of the species that we find and the absence of certain indicators. We can look at the grasslands and we can see species in them sometimes that tell us about these being ancient grasslands. So if you were to go to, I've not been since it got developed, but the old Abbeydale Hall, for example, the lawns, the grasslands at the Abbeydale Hall, when it was an environmental centre, had lots of white-cap fungi on it. And those tell us you're going back several centuries. They're ancient grassland species. We didn't find much in Worlow Brook because it's a relatively young site, created in about 1900. So the grasslands are interesting. In terms of things like improving the ecology, we would like to concentrate on things like the idea of ecotone, the edge habitat, and you can just change your mowing regimes to pull the mowing out a little bit and extend the ecotone. That's a really valuable bit. I was talking about scrub in the video. That's a bits which are really good for wildlife. So even though these are new and often manicured grasslands, we can do things to improve them. In certain areas of the park, it would be inappropriate to kind of rewild the lawns or the grassland because it's an ornamental park and you need to maintain that visual impact. But we can actually soften the management, and in the long term that saves money on grass mowing, grass cutting. So the things that we can do there to enhance that. We're also suggesting that for the park we need to think beyond the park boundaries. So we have farming landscapes to one side with some nice old fields and fantastic old hedgerows that we looked at. There's some quite intensive farming nearby that could offer opportunities for a rather more extensive kind of management. That's a matter of talking to landowners and seeing what they can do. Immediately to the south we have the playing fields where the City Council and the Wildlife Trust are doing some fantastic stuff. Towards the bottom half of that site they have changed the mowing regime, they've planted up new woodland and they've seeded in or used green hay from beechif to enhance the grassland. And over the next 5 or 10 years you will see that transformed into a fantastic wildflower area. It's already happening. When we did our surveys there, we actually got some really nice indicator species and those are going to increase, and we've also got wetlands within that area. So that's looking really good. And that will then provide species that come back into the park itself. So the areas around. And you've got the garden part of the park which we can enhance. You've also got gardens particularly to the east of the park, private gardens, and the people there can be encouraged to do their bit for nature. So there's all sorts of things that we can do. What we found was that the gardens were, most of us here will remember visiting the gardens. I remember going there as a kid and they were wonderful flower-rich, bedding plant-rich gardens. And of course they then had the problem of cuts in local authority funding, and that kind of garden-esque approach to parks was no longer feasible. And the Friends have been doing a great job trying to kind of recover that from quite a long period of relative neglect. The problem we've got now is that the gardens are they're patchy in terms of their ecological benefit. You can go in the autumn and you find there's a standard, I think it might be standard cotoneaster, and there's some hawthorns and things like that with berries, and they are brilliant for the wintering thrushes and the other birds. There are the birch trees which are fantastic for the finches, and I think we had siskin or redpoll when we did the surveys. But a lot of the garden is basically what I would describe as underperforming in terms of ecology. When we did the butterfly and bumblebee walk, we didn't find very much. So it's been kind of recovering the garden from a period of neglect, but we really need to think about how to make the gardens, particularly in the period May, June, July, August, they should be buzzing. You should be able to hear the bees in there, and I'm not hearing that when I'm in there. The rookery garden around the pond is good with azaleas and rhododendrons and the like, and there's a lovely wet garden to the side of the ponds. Some of the other stuff we could enhance quite easily. And you're looking at this from a point of view of it being visual as well as ecological. So you should think you want colour, you want interest right the way through the year, but you also want habitat and resource for the insects. And that's easy to achieve. Things like foxglove you can seed in, marjoram, you can plant buddleia, red valerian, and they will grow on the dry stone walls and things like that. You can actually establish these things, and then it's free. You know, they will seed themselves, and it will be full of insects. If you look at, for inspiration, things like the gardens at Hardwick Hall, for example, you should, in summer, you're thinking about massed areas of crocosmias and alliums and lilies and things like that. So you're looking at things being really vibrant and buzzing with insects. If you've got the insects, you've got the birds. So we need to think about that. And of course, within everything I've said so far, you look at the habitat for nesting birds, and it's very, very limited. So we need to think about, you know, what can we do in terms of habitat supplements. The ponds are troublesome. So that's something that we need to think about. They have great benefit, and that's where some of the birds are. And when we did the bat walks, which were really exciting, the ponds were brilliant for bats. The big pond, the lake, was where we got the most diversity, and we got really good close-up to long-eared bats, which was fantastic. But the big pond was really good for feeding bats, probably coming from the roost actually in the hall itself that we found. So that was really exciting. But the ecology of the ponds is not working. The ecology of the ponds is not functioning. You can see that they're covered in fine sediment. That will have been made far worse by wind blow and water runoff from what's happened at Rough Stand Hills. That's quite clearly going to impact on that. So we need to think about those problems. We've got some dragonflies and damselflies. We're not sure about them breeding. There's almost no aquatic vegetation in either of the ponds, vegetation in the water. We've got emergent vegetation like the skunk cabbage, and I put my hand up and say I actually quite like skunk cabbage, but for some reason I can't smell it. Some people say it stinks, but I don't know, I can't smell it. So the ponds we'll come back onto, but we need to think about what the solutions are. The streams, again, very intermittent. In the autumn and winter, they were really flowing with water through the cascades. In the summer, they were dry. And we have the main thing, the big project the Wildlife Trust have been doing is the slowing the flow down the main stream adjacent to the park. And hopefully that will start to have some benefit as well. And we gathered a lot of information on key species, so we now know a lot more about what we've got. We've been talking about making it easy for people to provide their records and recordings. We've got a recording system which is fine in terms of actually capturing some data, but I would also like to have something which is very, very easy just to upload. I went to the park photographing, I think it's 5 mandarins, a couple of female mandarins, a little grebe, a tufted duck, some mallard. I had a buzzard land in a tree, and I had a flock of pink-feet geese go up. I'm too busy to do a fiddly little form. I just want to upload the data somewhere and share it with people. Now that is a good way to promote what we're doing in the park. So we need an easy way to send the information and upload your records. Not necessarily in fine detail, but just saying this is what we're seeing. I had a peregrine fly through as well. So that's the sort of thing which people then pick up, and other people will go back there to look at. So we need to identify, and we try to do this in the reports, and priorities for future action. We need to have a vision, because what you're doing is setting down your thoughts now as a vision that will take things forward for the next few years, but also hopefully for future generations. And we've identified some of the problems. So problems can also be opportunities. And we've been thinking about solutions to some of these. So with the Grasslands, we would look at zoning, so pulling management out away from the edges to have more of this ecotone habitat, reducing your cost on grass cutting. No, I don't want to go online, it's all right. These machines have got a desire to do their own thing. Woodland management, so I know the group's been very involved in planting up rough stand hills, so that might start to remediate some of the problems there. It would be useful to do an assessment of the drainage and see if there's anything that we can block. Because what's happening, I think, is when they planted it with the conifers, they will undoubtedly have cut drains down to the Lynn Brook, down the hillside, and that's taking the water, which is very limited for the ponds, away from our catchment. So we're seeing this catchment drying up, so that is a problem. And we also suggested that we need to do things like enhancing the site with dead wood. And with tree management, we know we're going to lose some of the trees. We know there's work being done to take out some of the trees because of diseases, but we need to then try and keep as much of the dead wood as possible. And I know we looked at a huge pile of dead wood overlooking the lake when we did a walk round, and I went back recently and it's full of all sorts of bracket fungi and rock pockets and things. It's a whole ecological system in itself. We need to make more of that, and we talked about if we get any big tree trunks either standing or falling, you just go on with a battery operated Black & Decker drill and drill some holes for your solitary bees and wasps and things like that. You can actually enhance the habitat relatively easily. There's a slowing the flow project, really, really important. And we need to think, what can the park do in its limited impact on the catchment? What can we do to help resolve that? We identified the deadwood issue as a problem. You know, there's not enough deadwood around, so you need to be thinking about brash piles and deadwood. And if you leave a fallen tree trunk, or you've got a tree trunk that's been topped and left standing, within a few years it will naturalise, it'll soften, and it becomes a fantastic bit of habitat. You know, this is where, if it's standing wood, that's where your woodpeckers are going to be, and your tree creepers and things like that. The lake is an issue, and it is far too big for the group to deal with. And my suggestion, I think we need to sort out, and this is a separate discussion with City Council, the erosion from the woodland, and that needs a proper woodland management plan, and it needs external grant because it's expensive work. But in terms of the actual lake, my strong recommendation is we leave it. You don't try and desilt it. You don't try and turn it back to ground zero. You accept it's what we call a successional ecological system, where you've got open water, you've got willow carr areas, you've got bits of alder, and you've got vegetation fringing it, and you allow it to go through that successional process. If you start trying to desilt it, you are talking about not even tens of thousands of pounds, you're talking about a lot more than that. And a lot of disruption and damage. Because when you open that silt up, you are going to release, whatever way you do it, you're going to release all sorts of toxins into the Lynn Brook, because it'll be festering and unpleasant. So the best thing is to leave it locked away. Years ago, I was involved with Forge Dam in the Porter Valley, and there's been a long-term problem of silting that you will be aware of because it's still ongoing, and the Friends of the Porter Valley are doing a sterling job trying to resolve that. But I think it was back in the 1980s, one of the Recreation Department members of staff decided to solve it himself, and he opened the sluice to Forge Dam, which killed the Porter Brook all the way downstream to its confluence with the River Sheaf, because it just released all this festering organic matter, and you've suddenly got no oxygen at all. So my thing is that we take that the lake is a fantastic asset. We ought to have more information on monitoring the duck populations and the breeding birds, etc. And it's also a fantastic place for the bats feeding over it. So I think leave it alone. Yeah, that's what I call the lake, the big one.
He means the mill pond.
So the final one on that is the silt and the bog garden. And you only got to look at the water, which we did on a couple of occasions, and we looked in, and there's nothing living in it. And there's a layer of silt deposited over layers of leaf litter, which are over deep layers of gunk. That's a technical term, by the way. So the question is, can we turn a problem into an asset? And I think the bottom pond at some point will need desilting. And the problem I've got with that is that if you do it at the moment, you will still have a problem next year and the year after and the year after because silt is coming in. So we talked about planting up the conduit between the two ponds, planting that with maybe reed mace and yellow flag iris, which then start to take out the silt and hold the silt. And we talked about planting up the neck end, so where the water comes in the big pond, with things like meadowsweet and flag iris and valerian and other stuff, which then act as a natural filter, again, to hold back the silt. Because what we're trying to do is to stop the silt getting into the pond here. And that's the big problem. And until you do that, you have got a problem. And if you desilt it today, you could easily spend 30, 40,000 pounds on desilting that pond. And in 5 years' time, you would have to spend another 30, 40, 50,000 pounds desilting it. So we need to stop the influx of silt. Now that's a catchment issue, so we need to stop any further erosion from rough stand hills, and I think the tree planting will have helped with that. But the other question then is that the two ponds are very different. And I've got lovely photographs of the top pond in its splendour with the rhododendrons behind it and the house when it was still gardened by the local authority, and it is delightful. It isn't so delightful today. And we thought about this long and hard. Again, you could go into both ponds and you could desilt them. It's technically very difficult. You will probably cause some further collapse of the dam walls, the pond walls, and you've got to get rid of the silt, which is horribly expensive. So the suggestion that we've made, we would like to see ways of getting more water into the system anyway. So that's the thing with rough stand hills and whatever else. It clearly comes down when it's wet in winter, it's dry in summer. One of the problems that was raised initially, and I think there is an answer to this, which is no, it's not a problem, was pollution from the farm and the landowners above. The question the group asked me was, is there something going into the water higher up that's causing a problem? Well, no, because the water from higher up isn't going into the ponds. So that isn't a problem. It's a problem that the water isn't going into the ponds, but there's no pollution from further up. Our catchment is very, very small, and it's round the house and up on rough stand hills. So that problem really is probably relatively trivial. I mentioned in the video the fact that the top pond is becoming a bog garden, and I know when we talked to the committee that there's an issue about health and safety, so we think, yeah, I think it needs like a safety, almost like a ditch around the outside of the pond, so there's relatively deep water from the footpath and kids aren't tempted to try and wade in from the edge. And that's what you're doing at the moment. I think that is worth carrying on. So limited, targeted clearance around the edge to keep some open water. But my thought beyond that is to actually talk to John Gilpin, who's the man responsible for City Council for the land, and get his agreement that I go to Ringing Low Bog and collect some bog builders. Now, the sphagnum mosses, we mentioned 3, they are really nice species to have. It's unique in Sheffield. You have the only bog garden, but they are not bog builders. There are others which grow and actually add to the physical growth of the peat bog, and I would like to introduce some of those into the pond to enhance what we've already got. And I think within 5 or 10 years you would find a transformation in that. You'd have a really interesting, exciting site, and we might even end up with things like marsh orchids and heath spotted orchids and even sundews on there. So it would be useful. You know, at the top of the catchment is Ringing Low Bog. It's perfectly appropriate. So one suggestion is that we actually accept that the top pond is becoming a bog garden and a marsh garden, add some more of the marsh plants to enhance that, add some more sphagnum to that, and celebrate it for what it is. That is then your natural silt trap to safeguard the big pond. And you concentrate on your desilting efforts on the big pond in a situation where there's less silt going in. Because if you if you try to do desilting both ponds, if you try and do all that, you are going to be spending lots and lots of money. The council hasn't got that money, you haven't got that money. So we need to think about, I'm trying to turn a problem into an opportunity. So the future, we would see an ongoing program of recording and monitoring, and the group has got friends now who you've met who do events and activities and can come and help run recording, and you've got your own skills from the workshops. Targeted interventions, so that's things like changing the mowing, really going for bust with the garden to try and get loads and loads of flowers in there. Imagine it in June or July and being in the garden and just the buzzing of the insects. That's what we're after. I don't think there's any buddleia, which is surprising, because buddleia is free. You just break a bit off and then go and stick it in. So things like that, red valerian, you just get some of the seeds and it'll be away. So there are interventions. What I've suggested with the ponds, which is up to the group to decide. I did run this past Dr. Kevin Spence, that some of you have met, the hydrologist who's doing the Slowing the Flow project with me on the Lynn Brook, and he thought the idea of trying to salvage what we can of the catchment and trying to target the management differently in the two ponds was eminently a clever idea, a good idea. The other thing that we would like to see, and we know from the project and from the publicity that the Friends have done, we've got people coming to the park saying, oh my God, I didn't know it was here. This is fantastic. And we've had people come and join the group as a consequence of the activities and the publicity, but we could do better. We need in the future to make this a really visual asset, not just for the immediate location, but for the people of Sheffield, as it was when I was a kid. Now, there were implications, when I was a kid, you came here and you could sit in the cafe and sit on the top and the kids could play on the lawns and all that type of stuff. We will have a new cafe very shortly. We will have toilets very shortly. A great relief to many, if you pardon the pun. So that is really good. This year we're in a fantastic position because we'll have a vision that the group has agreed. We'll have a program. We'll have facilities, and then it's really, I think in one of the articles I wrote, I said the hard work starts here. So it's over to you. So thank you very much.